From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Imagine running into a woman, maybe in a pub or a cafe, maybe just online. She seems very ordinary, quite sweet, harmless really, until she isn't.
This woman's stalking you?
Yeah, like 6 months maybe.
Why'd it take you so long to report it?
I think she needs help. She comes to my work, my house. She sends me emails like all the time.
Are any threatening towards you?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that's particularly threatening.
Suddenly, this woman is everywhere, all the time, and she's not so friendly.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is my stalker. Say hello to Mark.
Don't you say that to me! Apologise to me right now!
The Netflix hit series Baby Reindeer has raised so many questions. What drives the dangerous obsession that makes someone a stalker? And for the stalked, just occasionally, do they almost enjoy the attention?
There's a reason you're keeping her around, and maybe it's what she gives you.
For some, the series has brought back difficult memories and forced them to consider whether, in some small way, they might have felt almost complicit when they were stalked by a stranger. We'll hear from someone who lived through the ordeal. The story today, Baby Reindeer and the complicated truth of being stalked. Sarah, would you mind just reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
My name is Sarah Ditum. I am a journalist with the Sunday Times and the Times and author of the book Toxic, Women, Fame and the Noughties.
Sarah, we've spoken to you on the podcast before about all sorts of aspects of celebrity culture, modern culture. Today, we're actually talking to you about something that you have first-hand experience of. So just take us back a few years and tell us, when did you first realise that you were being stalked?
Gosh, that's a good question. So my encounter with, I hesitate to call her my stalker because she had a lot of targets and it turned out that I was very low in her list of interests. So she was quite a prolific stalker. And in the scale of things, I received quite relatively minimal contact. But yes, so in 2010, I had my first ever tweet to go viral. Very exciting for me back then.
It's a proud moment
for anybody. There'd been a particularly egregious article in a lads mag. I was working in a consumer magazine office at the time. We had a copy of this lad mag lying around and it was basically just mucking about in the office. My friends had said, go on, take a picture, put it online, see what happened. And I did. And it turned into a whole furore, which obviously meant we didn't do any work on our magazine that day because it was all too exciting. So that had happened. I'd had a few byline pieces at that point, but I was very new to being someone with a public profile, which is kind of important when it comes to how I responded to things. Then the next day after this tweet had happened, it had all blown up and, there'd been apologies and donations to a women's charity and, all that kind of stuff.
This is the lads mag.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff that used to happen. A tweet popped up in my mentions and it was an account I'd not seen before. And the tweet said something along the lines of, so who do we go after next? Ms. Ditum. And I remember reading it and feeling that there was something slightly off about it, finding the tone a bit too ingratiating. But at the same time, it was part of this whole experience of feeling suddenly significant on the internet, which had not happened to me before. And I quite enjoyed the attention. So whatever initial red flag I should have noticed or I should have responded to in that message, I didn't. And I engaged with this person. I spoke to her. I followed her back for a time. And gradually, over the course of a few months, I became more and more uncomfortable with the level of her attention, with the way that I saw her engaging with other people, and most of all, with really the volume of her communications, which were very, very extensive. And at some point, she went from being someone who saw herself as an admirer of me to someone who was hostile to me. And the kind of relationship had already been established. And I felt completely under attack and adrift in terms of how to navigate and deal with this person. So it's really important to say that this is an encounter that happened only online. I just had an incredible volume of communications and a real canniness, I think, about the way that she would exploit the kind of architecture of the internet to make sure that her communications get through. So, for example, after I had blocked her, she would put my Twitter username in the title of blog posts that she wrote about me, so that when they were shared, the automatic tweet that was generated meant that other people would send tweets directed to me, notifying me of her talking about me. And I think that is one of the issues for victims of stalking is often you don't see yourself the way your stalker sees you. Obviously, there's an asymmetry in that relationship. And you have to start to think of yourself as a person with a kind of public profile that you need to protect.
At the height of this, you said the sheer volume of contact was horrific. Give us a sense of how bad it got. And what was the trigger for her going from somebody who was clearly a fan to somebody who was quite negative?
So I think the contact escalated to several times a day. At one point. It's very personal stuff. If it had been a man, I think I would have interpreted it straight away as sexual harassment because it was, very much focused on my appearance, her attraction to me, speculation about my sex life, really like unpleasant, intimate stuff to see on the internet. And I think one of the worst parts was that she would put herself into conversations on social media. So if I was talking to somebody, someone replied to me, then she would reply as well. And that would mean potentially that people who knew me in real life, who might follow me on Twitter, would become aware of this person with this very strange interest in me. And that's a very attacking situation. It's a very harrowing and vulnerable position to be in.
For people who haven't been in that position, just explain what it feels like to be stalked. You wrote about this recently and about sort of the references to hunting. Just explain how it feels.
It activates quite a primal, instinctual part of you to know that you are the prey, essentially, for somebody else, that you are being pursued. It activates your fight or flight response, obviously, and you can't really fight this person and there's nowhere to flee to. So you're just left in this position of being continually under attack. And I should say here that the most important thing is that you never engage with this person. And I remember thinking, but how can I not? This person is all over my social media. She's causing these potential problems in my personal life. How do you just ignore that? And the truth is, you can, in fact, just ignore it. And once you've made that break away from thinking that you are somehow obligated to respond, that you have some kind of reciprocal relationship with this person, that can begin to break down the kind of the bond that has been imposed on you by the stalker. And it takes you away from feeling that you are trapped in this relationship with them and makes you aware that you actually have some power and control over what you give to them.
You've written with extraordinary honesty about how that feeling, that obligation to respond, how it made you feel like maybe you'd somehow been complicit in all of this. Just explain why you think that.
I think there's a really important distinction to make between blaming yourself when these things happen to you and, I guess, feeling a kind of compassion for yourself for making poor choices in the past and being able to think about how you can make different choices in the future. And I think blaming yourself is kind of futile, unhelpful, will make you miserable and angry with yourself. Feeling compassion and thinking about how you make different choices is the way that you protect yourself from future versions of this harm. That's a really key distinction to make. I remember really distinctly feeling that flinch of discomfort about that first message. I remember feeling increasingly overwhelmed and uncomfortable with the volume and character of the kinds of messages she was sending. But I didn't respond to that in the way that I now know I should have done, by shutting down contact, blocking, and making sure that she had as little access to me as possible. And I didn't do that for 2 reasons. One of those was that it felt awkward, which is very silly, but that is the primary reason
natural.
that, it's awkward to say no to somebody when they've asked you to help, or when they've, if somebody asks you for something. Awkwardness is an incredible power that can be used coercively against people. But the other one is that her attention gave me a feeling of being important. And it was part of this moment when I'd, acquired a public profile for the first time. And I think that, essentially my vanity was my weakness at that point, right? And a sharper, more savvy version of me would have said, like, this is not important to me. This is not something I need to have in my life. I can shut it down. And I didn't do that. And that is what I look back on as being the mistake, and a mistake that I have been careful not to replicate.
And it's so interesting that you write about that. That sort of sense of a slightly symbiotic relationship, which is not always the case with stalking, but just sometimes it can occur, where it feeds a bit of your vanity, the attention that you're getting, and obviously it feeds something within the stalker. That relationship has been the subject of this hit series, which has taken Netflix by storm, Baby Reindeer. That also features a female stalker, and I wonder if that makes a difference. It's not the norm. But for anyone who hasn't seen it, would you be able to just explain what the series is about?
So the series is written by and stars stand-up comedian Richard Gadd. He plays a character called Donnie, who he said is very closely based on him and his own experiences. Donnie is working in a bar when a woman called Martha comes in. She's distressed. He offers her a drink. She says she doesn't have enough money for a drink. He makes her a cup of tea. And that's the kind of inciting incident for a campaign of harassment by Martha against Donnie that spans thousands and thousands of emails, messages, hours of voicemails, and ultimately involves physical attacks within the programme. But one of the things that the programme is really about is Donnie's acknowledgement that Martha gave him something, that this was a relationship that was, unpleasant, stressful, criminal, but that he got something out of. And one of the really shocking things in the series is that he goads Martha at certain points. So when she goes quiet, he goads her. And I think many people watching that will think, oh my God, why would you ever do that?
Yeah. Why would you encourage it? Why would you want to bring it back?
Right. But I think it's very good on the psychology of that experience, because there is a feeling of being able to monitor your stalker when they are in contact with you. You know what they're thinking. And you also know they're thinking about you, which is flattering if unpleasant. So when they go quiet, it's anxiety making. And I think any victim of stalking would probably relate to the fact that sudden silence, it might mean that they've given up and gone away, or it might mean that they're retrenching and considering another line of attack on you, which is an incredibly vulnerable moment. And because Donnie in the series is a spectacularly flawed and in many ways reckless character, his response to that is to make direct contact with his stalker. It's a complicated story. It's not in any sense a kind of a story of innocent victimhood. It's a story of somebody who is playing out an awful lot of messed up, difficult experiences through this incredibly bizarre and traumatic relationship with a stalker that he plays a part in continuing, however much he doesn't want it to continue.
With Baby Reindeer, one of the reasons as you described that the Donnie character almost goads Martha, the stalker, is partly about control, partly about knowing what they're thinking and being a bit uncertain when they're not in touch. How much does he need that sort of contact? How much is he complicit? Not just in terms of being able to control her movements, but almost needing the attention.
Yeah, I think that's one of the very sort of strikingly frank parts of Baby Reindeer. So anyone who's watched it will have seen this. But at the end of the show, Donnie actually has kind of become obsessed with listening to and cataloguing all of Martha's voicemails to him. So he essentially listens to these messages as if they're a kind of personal podcast, I suppose, addressed to him. And there is, I think, an element here that Gadd is really honest about, where Martha's attention shows him that he is the most important person in the world to at least one person. And when Martha kind of goes quiet and disappears, he experiences it as a kind of bereavement. And that certainly was something that I uncomfortably recognised actually from my own experience of being stalked, because there's an impulse to keep an eye on your stalker, right? But it means that kind of inadvertently, you do end up in a relationship with them. And after my stalker had been sentenced, which was not related to her actions against me, it was focused on her harassment of 2 gay male journalists, she went quiet. And then in 2015, she seemed to just sort of disappear off of the internet completely.
How did that feel for you?
Really weird, actually. And I would Google her intermittently and found out that over the last few years, she had gone missing on and off. My stalker had gone from this position of being engaged with online, having people who were interested in what she was doing, to just like gradually over time, there would just be sort of fewer and fewer people tweeting out the missing persons notices or saying that they were worried about her. And every once in a while, it would just sort of occur to me that I'm like probably one of the last people in the world thinking about her. And that felt quite sad. And, you know, in a way, she kind of got what she wanted, right? I did feel this obligation to her, even if I'd never wanted it and would prefer it had never happened.
You've written really compellingly about what the experience must be like from the stalker's perspective. Just explain what you've come to learn about that. You know, whether the contact is positive or negative, it seems to feed something.
Right. The stalker is engaged in a relationship with you, and how you feel about that relationship, your inner life, is completely irrelevant to the stalker's experience of that relationship. Anything that you send them, any kind of response, is feeding that relationship. If you email someone and say, leave me alone, go away, this is distressing, what you've actually told the stalker in their mind is that they are important to you, that you have replied to them, you have feelings about them, and the relationship is continuing. Anything can be taken as a kind of coded message that feeds this internal fiction that they're developing.
Did you have to worry a bit when you were writing about your experiences? I mean, do you worry that although she's disappeared for now, you know, the stalker might read it and suddenly be back?
So one of the reasons I haven't written about it until now is that I wasn't sure what had happened to her. But I do know that a few years ago she died. So it was not a risky thing for me to write about this, except in as much as it's kind of, you know, a bit embarrassing to talk about it all now. One of my friends had gone to her sentencing and reported back about her. So I'd never seen her. I have never seen her in person. And sent me this kind of pen portrait of a very like gaunt, very shy, very overwhelmed by the experience, hardly able to speak. And, you know, this was someone who was extremely voluble in her communications online, presented herself as very articulate, barely able to address the court, you know, with, you know, terrible standards of personal hygiene, awful teeth. I remember feeling just pity for her, which I didn't really want to feel. You know, this was someone who had made my life quite unpleasant for quite a long time.
Yeah. You wrote something that I found really startling and sort of slightly stopped me in my tracks, because you talked about how we've all tried so hard to change the culture around victim blaming for years, but perhaps that's sort of become part of the problem in looking honestly at some of these situations and learning from them.
Yeah, it's a complicated one. And I think I've spent about 3 paragraphs trying to get it right. So I'll try really hard not to get it wrong.
But it was really startling. I mean, I was amazed, but, you know, I hadn't thought of it like that before. It was one of those moments that you think, oh, that's so smart.
So I think over the last, I would say, decade, 15 years, there's been a really strong and important push to identify patterns that we kind of refer to as victim blaming, which is when someone presents themselves as a victim of violence and the immediate response is, well, what did you do to deserve this? And it's something that happens most pointedly to female victims of sexual violence or male violence of various kinds. You know, the kinds of questions are like, well, what were you wearing? Like, what did you say to him?
Yeah.
Why didn't you leave? All of these things which come up in courtroom environments and are deployed against victims to make them seem like the guilty party rather than the person who's harmed them. And that's really important that we have this critical attitude to that kind of victim blaming. But there's also a kind of concept creep that happens with it. So you start with the idea of victim blaming, and then you say, well, therefore, anything that asks questions of the victim is a bad thing, is a taboo thing that we shouldn't do. And actually, that's quite disempowering for people who've been victims of violence of various kinds. There's a really good book called The Gift of Fear by a guy called Gavin de Becker, where he points out that actually in the majority of violent situations, again, not all violent situations, but the majority of violent situations, there will be something that tips you off that things are not right before it becomes violent. And if you've been through a violent situation, one of the most important sort of things you can do for yourself is to say, well, I recognized that moment then, and I can recognize it in the future. And in the future, I can respond to it. And that's a really important, actually powerful thing that victims of violence and harassment can do. Whereas telling people, well, there's nothing you could do, you are, entirely helpless in this world and this could simply happen to you again and there's nothing you can do about it, is actually not particularly helpful. It entrenches people as victims and it defines them as helpless. And I think you have to track a line with the victim blaming discourse where you don't blame, but you support, and you support in such a way that you allow people to understand that there are other ways of responding to these situations that can be better for them in future.
There is a sense people who are the victims of stalking often say this, that if they go to the police, they feel they're not taken seriously.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to somebody who is going through it? Because I imagine for a lot of people, they don't really know when they are being stalked. You don't know when you should even call it stalking. From having gone through the experience and being able to look back on it now, what would your advice be?
So I think for anyone who finds themselves in a situation where they are receiving persistent, unwanted attention and communications, the first thing to do is to resist the temptation to engage. You can't argue it away. You can't repel it with aggression because that will simply be interpreted and incorporated into the fiction that the stalker is already living in. Do keep records of it. So do save and screenshot the communications that you receive so that you can build up a pattern of behaviour in future. Do speak to specialist agencies like Paladin, which specialise in supporting victims of stalking, because they give very good advice and are very supportive when it comes to people approaching the police and making their case there. And you're absolutely right that in many cases, the police do not take this kind of thing particularly seriously. And part of that is because stalkers, this is in the show, actually, this is part of Martha's behaviour. Often stalkers, even though they seem chaotic, they are actually very savvy about knowing the rules and navigating around them. So it's possible to harass someone extensively without ever doing something that tips over the Malicious Communications Act, for example. Which is why, one of the reasons why the woman who stalked me was ultimately prosecuted, because her messages to these gay male journalists included homophobic abuse, and that tipped over the Malicious Communications Act line. For example, in the show, a lot of Martha's messages to Donnie, it's not the content of those messages, It's the volume of the messages and their focus on you rather than the content of any specific message that is having this effect. But it's difficult. Like, there is obviously a line between freedom of speech, freedom of communications, and this kind of overwhelming stalking stuff. A lot of people defended my stalker because they saw her as a kind of an agent of free speech rather than a woman who was obsessive and quite alarming and harming other people, harming herself as well with these obsessions. And the law is put in this difficult position where it has to define where does freedom of speech end and harassment begin, which isn't, it's very obvious if you're on the receiving end, but it's not necessarily clear in a courtroom.
That was Sarah Ditum. You can read more of her work at thetimes.co.uk, and she's also the author of the book Toxic: Women, Fame and the Noughties. And if you haven't heard it already, I would really recommend going back and listening to our podcast with Sarah on celebrity culture. We'll put a link in the description to this episode. If you've been affected by any of the issues we've talked about today, do have a look at Paladin, the charity that Sarah used for help. You can find them at www.paladinservice.co.uk, and we'll put a link to that too in the description. The producer today was Edith Rousselot, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme tune were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a lovely weekend.